Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. Hope you'll enjoy listening. This one is from Just Rusty. It's about games as Blackjack 2 cashing out. We did a previous Parley about games as Blackjack. Basically the idea that a lot of games, a lot of video games, a lot of games that don't look anything like Blackjack, where you hit me until you hopefully get close to under the target number, or you go over and lose, you bust. Many games, well, build systems are like that. Basically, they're just saying, can you hit enough to get something good, take risks enough to get something good before you bust, take a risk too big that you die, or whatever it is. And there's lots of other models you could do. A lot of games are basically just that risk-reward tension. There's a concept that's similar in Japanese game design called game essence, or game sense, I would almost describe it as. But it's hard to translate because it's a cultural context idea. It means like the essence, the push and pull of the game, the conflict, maybe it's worth saying, of the game. Do you get how a lot of those are kind of blackjack for a lot of games? It's basically blackjack. Or when there's a sort of hidden subgenre within games, which is whether or not a developer expects you to be playing the blackjack game of investing in power later at the cost of power now, or just taking whatever seems strong at any given moment, / not aiming for synergy. The idea I posed in the last parlay, being that it's possible to realize halfway through a game that it has in fact not been made for you. This idea already takes a lot of unpacking that I won't do here, though we might get to it later. But basically, I want to note that a lot of people don't think of games that way. They do what they want to do in the game, and the game is so and so good at fulfilling their desire or not. For many people, there isn't really a step, or they think they do this step, but they're not really thoroughly doing it, of analyzing the game to see what type of play it enables, objectively on its own, as best as you can tell. Not what do you want to do and then how well does it do it, but what type of play does the game the best serve? And people mostly don't do that because they believe that they have engraved on their soul a set of desires that they are, and those are immutable, and they must do those things. That's who they are. I'm here to say it's not, but I mean that is how a lot of people behave. And so sure, in practice, I'm not going to be naive, most people end up thinking of it as invest in the blackjack game, power later at the cost of power now, or take strong at what's at a given moment, don't aim for synergy. And the result is that for a lot of people, the game makes it clear which side it's on or what compromise of those things it's going for by the mid game, but most players just don't care. And that's the point at which they'll develop an opinion about the game's build system, but not necessarily the point at which it will be clear to most people that the game is not made for them. And if you do care about this, it is beneficial to play a game, quote, made for the desire you want, because it's more fulfilling that way. More of the game's design serves getting that fulfillment out of it. A really common example of this that I would imagine I used during the last parlay, but I don't remember, is the idea that a lot of games are randomness focused, so roguelikes, right? This will be an arcade style experience where you roll in, you start a run, basically fresh, get upgrades as you go, reset when you die. Almost all modern ones include some meta progression where you get materials over time. That was at one time referred to as the roguelite genre, but that is now currently 99.99% of all such games. So it only makes sense to just call those roguelikes. They're like Rogue, they're just not any longer almost ever like Rogue in that they completely reset when you die. That's normal and doesn't mean that it's weird to call them roguelikes. That's just what happened in the genre. I think for a little while it was up for debate whether that's the way we were going to go, but at the moment I think that is the more useful way to use the term. For many people, roguelikes are one thing. They are about randomness. They're about the run popping off at random, or they're about using the things you're given and improvising a coherent build. Making coherent builds still, not really at all about randomness, but more like a deck builder, where your deck intends to do a coherent, non-random thing. It just does it in a randomized order or process, which creates variance and various other challenges. And these are often considered to be opposing. A given game does only one of them. And again, that people really think of the roguelike genre as only doing one, most often the randomness one. But various games are more and less focused on the randomness versus making randomized but improvisation intentional build decisions. And you can think about your own experience with roguelikes that you've played and think, is Risk of Rain 2 or Hades 2 or Slay the Spire or Darkest Dungeon or, Dead Cells a game that is more or less like this or that? And I hope you would at least agree they're obviously different, right? Hades 2 and Risk of Rain 2's build system or build systems, such as they are not the same focus on randomness or the run popping off. They're different. Even if you play them both as one way or another, they're not the same. And so you could see people having that perspective. Yeah. And so here we are with that as a starting point. Just Rusty wants to talk about OXTO, the only game I've ever seen which manages to cater its extra hard difficulty offerings to both crowds. Oh, and what this does to the game. I think I've talked about it in passing in other Parley. Yep. But a quick refresher. OXTO is a top-down kicker, taking a lot of cues from Hotline Miami and adding a roguelike progression system. I think that if you look at footage of this game, as I did, you probably will recall the vague gameplay format, but it is very hard to describe. Right, top-down door kicker is good. As good as I was going to do. Well done. It does two things I like and I think are brilliant, and one thing I hate. All right, two things you like first. One, it's a very simple pick 3 or re-roll system. But the fact you get increased money for the shop from having a high combo during levels forces the player to play in the most fun way by taking risks. So I don't understand how that's related to combos. It's a very simple pick 3 or re-roll system. But the fact that you get increased money from the shop for having a high combo meter during levels focuses the player to play in the most fun way by taking risks. So I feel like you haven't said this, but what you're implying heavily is that you either have to hurry to pick your upgrade or you lose your combo, which to me sounds kind of bad. It means if you think faster, then you don't have to play in a less planned out way to keep your combo. You simply get to pick 3 and re-roll, and you have plenty of time to do that depending on who you are. But what you're implying is that there would be some benefit to not obsessively selecting every little thing in your build, and instead to throw caution to the wind a little bit by playing faster or more recklessly to keep the combo going. An example that probably has the same effect as what you're describing, but which I understand because I just made it up, would be to have it be that if you don't re-roll, you get bonus money. That's weird. Diegetically, in the story of the game, I'm not sure how you're going to explain that, but I'm sure you can figure it out. There's a god of whimsy that pays you for being impressed, for not re-rolling. I don't know. That's fine, and so, sure, if you get an upgrade that you want right away, that's good, even though you could have re-rolled to try to get it anyway, if picking it right away without re-rolling confers money. In fact, you could probably put that directly in a lot of games, and it would do basically that. In Hades 2, you can re-roll if you leverage the re-roll system, and every other system the game gives you to control this. You can re-roll such that you are pretty guaranteed, statistically, to get the upgrade you want, but it's still good if you get the upgrade right away, because you don't have to spend re-rolls or other gerrymandering in the game's build system to get the game to give you the upgrade you want. You could take this further by having it be that the game will literally let you pick any upgrade you want by using a reroll. Like something like rerolls can't give you duplicate things. So if the pool is only of modest size, you can see that you didn't get what you wanted, reroll, and then reroll, and now you've seen everything in the upgrade pool, for example. The game could literally guarantee that you get what you want, but still make the randomness relevant by simply making it so you get a benefit for using the first set of things that you're presented with. And I imagine what you're saying is that it's something like this. Let's come back to that point a little later. The other brilliant thing is that as you unlock new guns, you can choose which ones are included in a run. This is a concept that the community and I have called whitelisting as opposed to blacklisting in build systems. This might seem normal, but the way all guns are acquired is additionally by taking them off of defeated enemies. Aha! Every weapon only has one loaded magazine and one spare, so you'll be swapping regularly. Before a run starts, you can visit a gun nun. That's interesting, to make decisions both about what you would like to shoot at enemies with, as well as, because you get all weapons off of dead enemies, what you would like to be avoiding and what you most want to get shot with at. How many weak pistols should you include in the lineup to dilute the pool to your next good weapon drop? Great example, by the way. So the idea is that because the game gives you a system by which you can whitelist items you want to play with, but that's then threatened by the fact that enemies are where you get all your weapons. You have an interesting incentive to include bad or just interesting variety weapons, even if you don't want them, because these are also the weapons you have to contend with. It's always possible the player has a few weapons that are all really good, but which they just so happen to be very good at avoiding. And the player hitting enemies with a weapon, depending on the game, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be hard to avoid if the enemies shoot at them with that weapon. Just for example, also the player's random modifiers might render some weapons so significantly different in the player's hands. You get it. That's not perfect without actually playing this game. Maybe it's very well managed in the game, but I do get why that's appealing. It's the benefit of a whitelist system where the player gets control over limiting the randomness, but with an incentive to encourage back in some of that randomness. Remember, Just Rusty's thesis for this parlay is that OXTO is doing something here to marry ways you can think about the game. If you don't think about the game as this blackjacky risk taker thing, well, that's okay. It's in the game's design to take some risks and control the odds. Yes, I think on a high level, I would agree that that's true. What I'm going to be challenging, I think, for the rest of this parlay is whether these mechanics actually do encourage that behavior, or whether they are just rhetorically, abstractly, the combination of a randomness and a control mechanic, but not necessarily, which I agree actually encourages you to use both of those things, is what I'm feeling out right now. But I definitely think those are both really cool. Let's hear the thing you don't like. Just Rusty says, I've spoken before about how I dislike the meta progression in OTXO. I probably said OXTO before, and I think I'm getting confused with 2XKO, which is the League of Legends fighting game. Anyway, OTXO, the game's power-ups come in the form of drinks purchased at a bar, and you can unlock new ones from the Drinks Smuggler. However, the game asks you to pay currency you need to win the run during your run to unlock new drinks. So in other words, the meta progression in the game comes during runs with the currency you get during runs to win that run. Interesting. The game basically gives you the option to fold, spend your winnings on new gear, and dip out. In my opinion, terrible game design. There's also a way to abuse it by whittling down a drink down to 1 coin to buy, then waiting till you get the God Run, and then adding that last strip of power for 1 coin to tip it over the edge to escape velocity, but without removing your save data. This is a trick you can only pull off once per drink. Thankfully, after unlocking everything, this bad game design choice evaporates. So to be clear, what Just Rusty is bothered by is that by the game giving you your upgrades between runs in this roguelike, during the run, with currency acquired during the run, normally you, it sounds like, need to pay so much currency to get a thing during a run that that run is basically over. Like, you need money to win the run that you have to pay to get this upgrade. So you basically have to say, this run isn't going that well. I'm going to spend the money I have, virtually guaranteeing I now lose the run, which was already apparently not going well, to get a new upgrade and then basically just die or dip out, which seems bad to you. And there is also a way to abuse it where you pay most of the cost to unlock an upgrade, but don't go all the way. That persists between runs because it's a persistent upgrade system, right? But then during another run that's going well or poorly or whatever, you pay the 1 coin to actually get the upgrade, which you get on the spot, which then makes that run pop off and basically makes it so you not only sacrifice runs and stop playing the roguelike to like unlock this persistent thing, but also it then unbalances future runs in the opposite direction. Double bad, right? Again, kind of like the positives you mentioned. I think this is one where I absolutely see the problem, but I think I'm probably going to end up disagreeing that it's bad because of the dual tension as much as just any roguelike game design where you have to think about the meta progression during the run is kind of just bad as far as I've seen so far. I have not yet seen that done in a way that a lot of people didn't hate, I guess, has been my experience. Sure. And I have an example for you from my own experience. Once you've finished the game and unlocked everything, Just Rusty concludes the parlay, the game gives you two challenges, an impossible mode and an achievement for a sober run of the standard game. These are probably of equivalent difficulty. I've managed about 2/3 of a run on both, but they offer a very different challenge. One is a build challenge, the other is a mechanical challenge. If someone was enjoying the game as a roguelike, impossible mode is for them. If they were enjoying it as a Hotline Miami-like, sober challenge is probably more appealing. Impossible mode has a very high lethality for both you and enemies, and reduces the ammo on found weapons to one loaded magazine and no spares. This puts pressure on both the build system, the combo system, as well as the weapon system. Weapons which can put out a high volume of fire are both now stronger for you, as only 1 or 2 shots will kill an enemy, and big magazines of low damage rounds help you clear lots of enemies before needing to swap weapons. Many weapons which were good choices in the normal game mode, as their high damage helped hit enemy breakpoints, now overkill enemies and are much more of a threat to you. You also have to clear almost every level in one combo or risk falling irrevocably behind the pace of the increasing difficulty of each floor. Cool. So again, in fitting with the topic of this parlay, OTXO here is trying to cross all of the things that make a randomness roguelike fun and the things that make an intentional randomized improvisation roguelike fun, and then also offers 2 challenge modes that are tailored for each of those playstyles. But note that here, these modes are not seemingly intended specifically to each appeal to both types of player. The core game was trying to do that, but then once you feel like you know which one you like, it then forks. This might be a game that is at its most effective for people that want to determine which they like more, actually, rather than necessarily being so good at serving both parties, though we'll get into that a little later. Sober mode becomes an almost entirely different game. Due to the shop not being a factor, rooms almost become combat puzzles you can think about one at a time, then solve in a moment of violence. Great line, by the way. The gun none system offers an entirely different set of weapons to the other hard mode. Here, chip damages your enemy, while ammo is abundant. Weapons with high damage and burst at the cost of smaller magazines are great picks, as the ideal goal is to clear a room before a shot is fired at you, because you have no upgrades as well. The result is 3 modes, which between them push you toward using almost all of the sandbox. The fact that even in the Buildcraft Lite version of the game, there are still some choices to be made is interesting to me, and I'm surprised this isn't an option we see more often. I guess the closest next door neighbor mechanic is games which have a daily challenge mode to push you to try different tools in the game sandbox, but this feels genuinely pretty different. Yeah, and a lot of people don't like those systems. It's like imposing live service on a game that was free of it. And it makes you have a different type of habit from the type of habit the game is normally asking you to have. I think a lot of people see this as good, and you should know that a lot of developers actually do this for engagement. That is, to make it look like the game has a more active player base than it actually does, by encouraging people to come back to briefly play this one challenge. A lot of people in the world still basically think if a thing is popular, that means it's good. They don't have time to think about whether the thing is actually good, which is not really their fault if you have ever looked outside lately. It's busy, things are happening. They don't have time to figure out what they would actually like for real reasons, so they try to use a shortcut reason. And this is one of the really bad shortcut reasons, which is if a lot of people are playing it, therefore that means it's not dead, which I vaguely perceive to be important somehow, even though it's just not. A game can have a even multiplayer population that will get you matches on a surprisingly small group of people. And in many cases, there's some system by which you barely need any at all, or, it's just not an issue. Granted, that's the place where it's the biggest deal, but it obviously then shouldn't matter almost in the slightest if the game isn't multiplayer, which this isn't as far as I can tell. Or at least you primarily play it solo if it has co-op, I would imagine. So yeah, that's weird, but it is a thing people do, and therefore a lot of developers add something to their game that gives you a reason kind of outside the normal play of the game to come back day in and day out, because if people finish your game in a week and then come back for 3 days of weekly challenges, from a metrics perspective, you've increased your engagement by 50%. This will absolutely make a huge difference when people are considering buying your game for the, as discussed, not particularly valid reason that it is popular, by looking at how many people log into it on Steam. That doesn't do anything or matter at all, but I mean, there are a lot of people who make decisions that way, and so this is a thing that some games do on purpose, pretty much just to make money. You can say that I'm being kind of a Grinch about this, like, if it's a fun game mode, who cares? But my point is that it's often not very in the line of the design of the game, whereas this absolutely is. You'll play the game for longer, but you'll be playing the game and exploring its systems, not a contrivance that is often there just to bring you back. Again, you might like those daily challenges, that's fine. I'm just arguing they are an additional ask. This system is better in that it isn't asking you to do something meaningfully different from what you already liked. And therefore, I think more people will like it. And the engagement, if you like, is more real. It's people who actually like the game more, rather than just who happen to be playing the game for longer, but not necessarily because they especially like it more. Cool. This sounds very cool, by the way. I want to do an aside that you did now, and then we'll get back into the groove of the other stuff you were talking about. So here it is. I think I had to do a special thing for this, but that's fine. You've got a graph for us. You say, as an aside for this, I also think the difficulty curve, pictured on screen, over time for the 3 types of runs is fascinating. Thanks for the little graph. Here you have sober, impossible mode, and standard, graphed with run progression on the X and difficulty on the Y. So you can see that impossible is starting higher, but then kind of plateauing often because your build stabilizes out, whereas sober, sort of the opposite, and similar initially to standard, but it goes up and up. With sober and standard obviously having the same starting difficulty, sober's challenge going into the stratosphere as bosses start to become real challenges without damage buffs, and impossible having a brutal early game difficulty while not getting too much harder over time as a build comes together. Right. As we talked about in the previous parlay, this pattern, the blue versus the yellow, is the usual pattern that will occur if you play a game by playing it focused on synergy or not. If you focus a game that has build systems that allow you to gain power from synergy on getting that synergy, then usually the game starts about as hard as it's going to be and quickly plateaus, or maybe gets a little dip later, as the blue line shows. And if you don't make decisions that build around certain synergy, the game often starts easier as you pick the single strongest in isolation thing you can find. But then as the game expects you to be able to get more power than just one more upgrade, some synergistic combo or effect or theme or goal in your build, but you don't because you're constantly picking non-synergistic options, the difficulty goes up and up slightly exponentially. And in many cases, I think that is the case. Now, as we talked about in the previous parlay, a lot of games just have one of these as the difficulty curve. And the problem with that is that then if you don't match it, then the game is just massively imbalanced. Either the beginning or the end will be ludicrously hard because games currently don't telegraph or define, like we currently don't have a genre term for randomness run popping off based roguelikes versus randomized but intentional build system improvisation roguelikes. And the problem with that is that because you don't know which one is when you go into it, in fact, as we discussed at the beginning of the parlay, most people don't even acknowledge the existence of the other one. They just think their way of thinking of it is right. But games are designed as if they have one or the other, or maybe both, or neither. They're in the middle of these. So they do determine which games you will enjoy the difficulty curve of, whether you think about them or not. For many people who've disliked a lot of roguelikes, but never thought of this was why they disliked some of them, surely. They just don't know that. This is another example of one of my favorite arguments of all time to debunk, that ignorance is bliss. One of the standard reasons why it isn't is because people who are ignorant suffer the negative things about the things they're ignorant of. They just don't know that they're suffering those negative things because of a decision they could have made differently. They still suffer the negative thing. They just register it as some misfortune from the heavens or something when it isn't. It's something that they don't know this, but if they were not so ignorant, they would be able to get out of, or Again, sometimes it's not their fault that their ignorance might seem like bliss, but the point is, it isn't. They still experience the negatives of that decision. They just don't know that those negatives can be eliminated elsewhere. I would argue that's actually even worse, right? You experience the negative and you think locally that the negative is an inviolable negative of all reality and existence, rather than something you can control, which means it's also negotiable. It might be able to not be negative that way. Anyway, without going on about it, great example and an extremely helpful and broadly illustrative graph of those difficulties. Very nice. Let's tackle those points from before, shall we? We had a couple of pins, those two things you thought were good and the one you thought was bad. I said at each point that I personally think these are extremely interesting pieces of design, but I'm not sure I agree that they actually encourage you to behave these ways as much as they just do on paper address both ways of thinking about this type of game. So let's look at the gun none example. I think this is probably the best one. So a whitelisting system in a game, to run it back for you, is that you, in this game, you can choose which ones are included, which weapons are included in a run. That might seem normal, but the way all guns are acquired is additionally by taking them off of defeated enemies. So at the beginning of a run, you can take the, let's just make up some numbers to use. You can take the 20 weapons in the game and limit them to 5, but also all weapons are looted off of enemies who fire that gun at you until you defeat them, and therefore you have to pick which weapons you want to be able to drop, but also balance it for those weapons being used against you to an extent. Again, how many weak pistols should you include in the lineup to dilute the pool for your next good weapon drop? There's a lot of ways you could use this system. One of them would be to find weapons which you find relatively easy to survive, but which you are good at killing enemies with. That is, what weapon are you the relatively best at avoiding relative to its lethality, and then pick that weapon. And so you have a weapon you're good at playing against, but which is the strongest weapon you're good at playing against. Another thing you could do is, depending on how this game's build system works, there are plenty of similar games I've played where builds are variably focused on the raw power of the gun. There are builds that use the gun's base effects or damage or output or special effects and augment them. So yes, the gun is good in those ways before, and the build just builds into those strengths. The gun has a quick reload, and the build that you make like wants you to reload, or like builds into reloads, or makes reloads even faster, or makes quick enough reloads instant, or something like that. But also, there are builds where the gun or whatever weapon in a game is there to primarily trigger a build. Sometimes you hear these called Rube Goldberg builds as well, where basically the idea is we don't really care what you hit the enemy with, we just need to trigger a hit. A really notorious example of this is rogues in D&D. They have an ability called Sneak Attack, their signature damage ability that they get right from level 1, where if they have advantage or some other related conditions, but basically if they have the drop on an enemy, if you want to think of it that way, under certain conditions, once per turn, they do a big pile of extra damage when an attack hits. They care not at all, and it doesn't affect the damage, what the attack is. Just that it is an attack that qualifies for Sneak Attack. It doesn't matter how much damage it does. And Sneak Attack does so much damage, so much more damage than every weapon in the game, that it really doesn't matter at all. It makes almost no difference what damage die the attacking weapon uses. Just as an example, if you trigger Sneak Attack with a dagger, you do 1d4 plus, I don't know, like 5d6 damage. And if you had to trigger that attack instead with a greatsword, you would do 7d6 damage instead of 5d6 plus 1d4 damage. But that's just not that much more. Like 6d6 damage and 5d6 plus 1d4 damage are basically one different on average. So by using the weakest or strongest weapon in the game by damage die, you've increased your damage by, on average, about 3. You know, like it barely does anything. When most of the time your Sneak Attack at that, what was that, like level 5 or something, would average something like, 20 damage. Increasing it by just 3 On average, from going from the smallest to the biggest weapon is just not a significant difference, let alone that D&D people, I know, you can't trigger it with a great, it's just an example. Like, but that's the point, you know. The point is, there are lots of builds, this is just an iconic example some people might already know, that are more like they want to trigger the thing. A really common one in games like this, maybe it isn't in this game, is that a rapid fire weapon with mediocre damage can rapidly trigger on hit effects, like chain lightning or something, would be a common example. The point of this is that those weapons are often very, very weak outside the context of that build. And so there can be a way to game the system where you can make a build that is extremely good when triggered by an appropriate weapon, but it doesn't really make the weapon's damage itself do anything more. I don't know if this build system calls to this. And it might not have to. Remember, having an element of controlling the build system, improvisation, randomized but intentional improvisation buildcraft, and the run popping off randomly, randomness focused systems in the game is not there so that the player can literally dual wield them necessarily. It's okay if the player has the ability to make them mostly about this or that. That's fine, in my opinion. Just that the game supports both, and you can lean into both if you want to. The game doesn't have to force you to play a run defined by this other idea. The fact that the run at least includes this and you work around it or deal with it however you want is of relevance, right? I also think that the gun none plus enemies having the weapons is really good for people who are not interested in the build system part. For many players, they don't particularly care. They want it to be random what weapons they get, or they at least think they want that. We'll get back to that in a minute. And so they wouldn't care about this feature as such. I've played games before that had whitelisting that very few people seem to use, or the Steam achievements indicated that few people seem to use. But in this game, you can also use it just to determine what enemies attack you with. If you really don't care, then just pick weapons you don't want to get hit by, which are adequately strong for whatever you're going to do. And yeah, that would be an interesting way to kind of fiddle with the impact of the run, or maybe some people will even think of it as like a difficulty modifier, even though it pretty clearly affects your performance too. Again, without knowing more about the build system, I can't predict too much how this is balanced out, but it seems to me like it's a system that offers something meaty and interactive and interesting, cool, meaningful choices that are not overly complicated, that you understand the context of. Meaningful and appreciable choices for people who like the game the one way or the other, or something in between, which is definitely a success as far as I'm concerned. Now, the reason I put it that way, though, is that when we go to these other options, I personally think it's a little more debatable that that would be like that. For example, the thing you said you don't like about the power-ups coming in the form of drinks and then you pay in the run to do the thing is something that I feel like has a ton of variance. So to read how that works again, the game's power-ups come in the form of drinks purchased at a bar, and you can unlock new ones from the drinks smuggler. However, the game asks you to pay currency you need to win the run during your run to unlock new drinks. So this means that during the run, you might be having a bad time or a really good time, or make a run specifically to get a lot of this currency in a run, spend it all on an in-run upgrade, and then basically just check out mentally of the run. How elegant the checking out part is matters a lot to me. It could definitely be really coherent. For example, I could see an interesting situation where when you fold or check out of the run, you cash out by spending your in-run currency, not to help you keep winning the run, but for one reason or another, because you think the run is dead, or because you just want this upgrade or something, or because the run's going really well and you have an excess of currency. You spend it all on these upgrades or whatever. To me, it's of great concern what happens after that a lot of the time. So, for example, what if you fight a unique boss when you do this and you can continue the run potentially? Or maybe you can't. Maybe you always can't continue the run that way. But to me, it's an example of a game where in a lot of games, you might farm that elsewhere. Like you would go get those upgrades from somewhere else. And you could argue that that might be a little better. Here is where I get to talk about Chaos Zero Nightmare. This is a game I play in my spare time that is kind of like this in that you can do a run and then save the results of your run in a roguelike game mode and use the results of that run, that snapshot of the roguelike run you did where your build popped off or whatever. You keep that And in other game modes in the game, which are not roguelikes, you can use that as a piece of your character's build system. So you give them items and level them up and have kind of normal or expected progression systems. But also, they get a set of, it's a deck builder, so it's the small deck, 8 to 10-ish cards, to give you an idea, that they had during a roguelike run that you did. And these are their core mechanics. This is how they do what they do. You can choose what deck they have, what specific set of 8 to 10 of their cards, by doing a run of the roguelike. And then you save that, you can slot it in and do non-roguelike game modes with it. This is key. The game then makes the important move to make it that you farm everything else for progressing your character from those game modes, not from the roguelike. And this is even more important, I think. You get nothing relevant to your character's progression during the roguelike, except people who play Chaos Zero Nightmare for artifacts, but you can get those without doing it as well, except that you could also farm by not doing the roguelike. And it's not especially more or less efficient, you're not farming stuff really during the roguelike. That's what I'm trying to get across. People who play Chaos Zero Nightmare, I know, give me a break, we're hand waving a little, but I think that is 99% true. That is how the game feels. And I think that's important because it means that you don't have this issue, right? You're not usually doing runs just for the sake of getting some meta progression upgrade, right? But Chaos Zero Nightmare actually still feels like it still has this problem, because you often do a run not to get a good result in the run or to win the run, but thinking, well, I'm halfway through the run, and if I win, nothing matters but how good my save data is for non-roguelike purposes. So if this is a good upgrade, but only in the roguelike mode, it's instantly useless if I succeed. Whereas if I pick this upgrade, it's almost certainly useful for something during the roguelike and doesn't brick my run, but it gives me better save data if I win the run. And many people doing this calculus choose not to pick things specifically for the roguelike. Enough that the developer of the game has actually added another game mode where you just don't generate save data. And it is interesting to see how different that feels and how different the game behaves in those moments. In other words, it's a problem. In the world, the emerging, exciting world of game design that is trying to be about making builds using a roguelike and then keeping them for other stuff, or again, even the thing where meta progression in roguelikes, pure roguelikes, is happening during runs instead of outside of them, there is an emerging issue that basically any time a roguelike run becomes a sort of task to fulfill some other upgrade rather than an end in itself, have a good roguelike run, people basically universally hate it. Is what at least I've seen, what I'm hearing from you, and frankly every single other person I have ever spoken to agrees that it just feels really bad. It's interesting because psychologically, shouldn't it be multitasking? The challenge of the roguelike is winning with a build that will be good even outside the roguelike, which is fun, right? And I've tried, when I play this game, very hard to think that way. And, I guess I'm here to say, if your job is to be the most open-minded person in the world and do infinite jumping jacks, and you have an entire career that is based on you just repeatedly doing ridiculous, arbitrary Q&A about any random topic possible, literally just click on this channel's videos thing and look at the topics of the last 12 videos. I am this person, so no shit, I can be open-minded enough to see the side of the argument where it's an interesting element of difficulty. Okay, it kind of works for me. That means absolutely nothing for the design in general, who cares that I can enjoy it? That doesn't matter. And I don't completely enjoy it. I don't really see why it wouldn't be better to somehow avoid that. Or something like allow the player to simply separately get upgrades for their run and for save data. Just as a simple example, you could do something like anytime you get an upgrade during the run, you get to pick a thing to take for your build now, but also you can highlight something in green. And this is a quantum version of whatever you upgraded that you'll default to at the end of the run. So if I upgrade my healing card and I get one version that is good for roguelike mechanic stuff and another version that is what I would like for my save data once the run is over, I can pick the one for the roguelike and then just highlight the other one in green. This means that at the end of the run, that will be replaced with this. The one I picked will be replaced with the green one. You can store the upgrades you get during the roguelike and then default to them at the end of the run. You still have to get them. That part is all still the same. They just don't impact your doing the run. This would not perfectly work in Chaos Zero Nightmare, but it is at least a start, I guess is the point I'm trying to get at. Likewise, here, it kind of seems to me like the developer's goal with your buy the drinks during the run was for you to use the drinks as a way to succeed more during the run. The idea is, well, what's more fun than doing upgrades abstractly outside of the roguelike gameplay loop, doing them in the roguelike gameplay loop, and then you get the upgrade immediately, huh? That's interesting. Okay, but then the issue is that it tempts you to make the runs into this divisive thing, into this transactional experience where you don't get to enjoy the roguelike run because you know that if you do, you're that much worse off because you didn't focus on upgrades. Or if you lose, that's because you didn't grind out some more boring but effective runs where you get a bunch of additional upgrades. And this is bad, I would argue. Sure. Again, to go back to my point before, what I was doing there is rejecting the argument I know some people will make, where they're going to say, why don't you just think about it like this? Well, I did, and I'm saying I don't think that's a practical solution. The topic of this parlay is making games that are not just able to appeal to people who play the game one way or another, but games which are about being for both people, games which have mechanics in the game that for everybody make the game this kind of experience. You don't have to be the kind of person who thinks of it that way. You don't have to just settle for the things that are in the way of you doing that. The game is actually about, there's things in the game mechanics that help you have this experience. It is amazing how hard I have historically had to try to get people to accept this line of reasoning. Many people simply make the point that if you can play the game away and they had fun with the game that way, all complaints about the game any other way are all invalid because they've demonstrated that you can enjoy the game if you play it in any arbitrary way. I just don't, this is not the helpful part of criticism. When we criticize something and recommend it to other people, the benefit is that the criticisms are, applicable to somebody other than ourselves. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying that you really liked this game by doing this. But that just isn't related to saying, I therefore think the game is like this, like it would be for other people reliably, if you can't point to what in the game does that. And I don't understand why that's so complicated for most people to accept, but you clearly do accept it, so I won't go on about this anymore. Thank you, Just Rusty. What a delight, by the way. Therefore, I personally relate to what you're saying here. I think that by the rhetoric of game design, this is a bad piece of design, and it doesn't matter at all whether people can think in a way where they bypass it. It only matters what type of gameplay the design supports. And the two types of design that the gameplay enables, the two types of gameplay the design enables, are to fold or to turbo your run. You can basically just have a bad run or a good run where you have a lot of excess currency and spend your winnings on new stuff. Or you can plan out getting those upgrades and then use them to turbo runs that are going well or poorly, by the way. We'll get back to that in a minute. And that is what the design does reliably for everybody. It doesn't matter if you can get it to do something else or enjoy it some other way. That's good for you. It's good for me that I'm doing it in my own game, whatever. But it's not a good thing about Chaos Zero Nightmare or OTXO. Because the game design does not reliably create that experience. It actively resists it, actually, by most metrics. At the very least, hopefully people can agree that it leaves it open, whether that is uncontrolled, uncurated, whether the player will have the good version of the experience if you like. And you could make design that makes it not uncurated. It would pretty much guarantee the player has the good experience of the design, and that would be better. That's what we're arguing. I just don't think this is quite so misguided as it seems with some small changes, I guess. I don't know. I like the idea that you could use it to mitigate bad results. And this is a place where I would argue that that is arguably less of a personal preference and more of like a philosophy, where in many game systems, players simply are fixated on getting the maximum result. They want to do the most damage. The game encourages that by providing a lot of challenge. But in reality, the player just isn't thinking of any way to get more effective other than doing more damage. A lot of people in many games play an aggressive strategy, not because that's what they prefer, but literally because they just haven't considered anything else. Or, I don't know, playing a lot of competitive card games, for example, because they simply don't have the patience mentally to win a different way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're just wrong and that's good. But my point is that that's a different difference than just the game doesn't guide them toward that. Well, the game doesn't guide them toward being aggressive either. They just, as a person, don't have like the ability to resist the call, the siren song of the aggro. And I don't think this is quite the same thing. The subtle differences between those, maybe I don't know how to unpack here. I think the important takeaway for me is that with game design like this, you've put yourself in a position where, as the game designer, you are forfeiting how the system is used, where you absolutely could make changes that just encourage the player to use it a different way. Just for example, you could make it so a lot of the upgrades are like better the worse you are doing in some way. Or like if you're doing poorly in a run, then the upgrades get like discounted or more expensive, encouraging you to commit to doing the run, or the upgrades are really expensive. So you don't do a gimme run, just the farm. Or you could make them cheaper if the run is going badly, and now they're tempting as a way to kind of save a run that isn't going well. You can juice up a run that isn't going so well and try to succeed. The upgrades are now so cheap, or maybe you get a temporary version of them or something if you're, doing badly, that you can use them to sort of snowball. Now, again, if you've played any build system before, immediately your thought ought to be, can people abuse that by like doing badly on purpose and then abusing the system? I mean, yeah, I don't know. Obviously, you need to address that somehow. I'm just saying there are things you can do to the design that will lead to it, encouraging one experience or another. Just a corollary example, Risk of Rain 2 has a mechanic, these blue coins, lunar coins. These are, Risk of Rain 2 has very few power progression systems between runs. You can upgrade new stuff, there's horizontal progression, but you don't really vertically get like more powerful, really. But you do get lunar coins, and you can use these to buy very powerful blue items of a new exclusive to lunar coins rarity from this shop. And so how do you use the lunar coins? The way I always use them, as I described earlier with my Chaos Zero Nightmare example, was to try to mitigate bad runs. When a run was going badly, I used the lunar coin to buy something powerful that might bail me out. Because when a run was going well, if you've played Risk of Rain 2, everything on the screen is deleted the moment you poke something with your middle finger. So obviously the items are still good. They're often multipliers, so they're better, arguably. But like they just didn't really feel necessary in the same way to have a good experience. And because a lot of the blue items are trade-offs, when you use them to save a run that's going badly, they don't just massively overpower the run becomes even more risky, just in a new way. You basically trade the devil you don't for the devil you do. And I think that's cool. Like, that's neat. If only, you can see where I'm going with this, the game encouraged doing it that way. Because I think for most people, when I've watched people play Risk of Rain 2 other than me, they use the coins when they're doing well, not poorly. And this is completely fine, they can do that. They're not doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. The critical point for me is the game design doesn't have an opinion about which way you should use them, in my opinion. The game design kind of just leaves it open. There isn't any game system I can think of that enforces or encourages or rewards doing it one way or another. So if you can make the argument that it's more fun to do it this way, well, the game doesn't make that argument. So I can say it as much as I want, but unless the game has a design that supports that, it's sort of not part of the game in particular. That's just a thing I have done that I think is fun. And because it's kind of neutral in Risk of Rain 2, maybe I can convince more of you to try that. I don't know. But go figure, right? The same here. If the point of this parlay is that this game tries to enforce some of that, multifarious nature, the game can appeal to multiple kinds of people, then I think the next step would be to solidify that even further. It's a case where they're doing a lot. I admire a lot of this design. I gotta play this game. But it does seem like in some places they do need to go even further. It seems like that feature didn't continue with the philosophy of, well, you need to put something in the game to encourage that behavior. Use the whitelisting system to interact with enemies and yourself, well, make the game about that. And it seems like they did. But then here it says get upgrades during the run for shenanigans. Well, but they didn't really do any further design that solidifies that. Obviously, as a disclaimer, Just Rusty, I take you at face value, but for all I know, there is something in this game that I would argue does do this, but you didn't feel did this, and that's completely fine. I would not blame you. It's up for debate, but I would like to see. Folks, if you enjoyed this parlay, you can get your own in the description. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.